April 1943. The checkpoint outside Toulouse materialized from the morning fog like a verdict. Nancy Wake, traveling under the name Lucienne Cartier, felt the weight of the forged papers in her handbag, light as ash, heavy as a grave. The German Feldwebel's eyes moved from the document to her face, then back again. He was young, methodical, trained to notice the micro-tremor of fear that separated the innocent from the condemned. She smiled, not the nervous flutter of a woman caught, but the lazy, faintly bored expression of minor aristocracy inconvenienced by wartime bureaucracy. Beneath her silk blouse, tucked against her ribs, were coded messages that would send 24 men to the firing squad if discovered. The Gestapo had a name for her now, whispered in their headquarters in Lyon and Paris. La Souris Blanche, the white mouse. The woman who slipped through every trap, vanished from every net, moved through occupied France as if she were made of smoke. They had her description. They had composite sketches. They had informants who swore they'd seen her. What they didn't have was her real face, her real name, or any idea that the elegant woman who frequented the best hotels and flirted with Italian officers was the same phantom destroying their operations from Marseille to the Pyrenees. The Feldwebel handed back her papers. She thanked him in perfect French, her German deliberately clumsy, and walked through the checkpoint with the unhurried grace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Only when the trees swallowed the road behind her did her hands begin to shake. This was not heroism. This was something colder, something closer to addiction. The space between capture and freedom had become the only place she felt alive. But the net was tightening. The Gestapo had increased her bounty to 5 million francs. And somewhere in the shadows of Marseille, the man she loved was already being watched. She had not been born to this. Nancy Grace Augusta. Wake came into the world in 1912 in Wellington, New Zealand, the youngest of 6 children in a family that immigrated to Sydney when she was still an infant. Her father disappeared when she was young, and her mother's strict religious temperament felt like a cage. At 16, Nancy ran. She worked as a nurse, saved her wages, and bought a one-way ticket to New York. By her early 20s, she was in London working as a journalist, and by the early 1930s, she had drifted into Paris, then into the glittering expatriate life of someone for whom Europe was not a place but a permission. She was beautiful in the particular way that unsettled people. Not fragile, not demure, but vivid, unguarded, alive in a manner that seemed almost defiant. She drank, she danced, she spent money she didn't have. In 1933, on assignment for a Hearst newspaper, she traveled to Vienna. What she saw there cauterized something inside her. Nazi brownshirts dragging Jewish men into the streets. Old women forced to scrub pavements with toothbrushes while crowds laughed. The casual, administrative cruelty of it, the bureaucratic glee. She watched a man beaten unconscious in front of a cafe while people sipped their coffee and looked away. She filed her report, but the words felt inadequate, impotent. You could describe evil, but description was not resistance. She did not yet know what resistance looked like, but she knew, with the certainty of a match struck in darkness, that if this came to France, she would not look away. By 1939, she was living in Marseille, married to Henri Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist who adored her with the kind of quiet, absolute devotion that embarrassed her even as it anchored her. They had a penthouse apartment overlooking the Vieux Port, a Bugatti, and a life that seemed designed to insulate them from history. Then history arrived anyway. The fall of France in 1940 was not a battle, but a collapse, a political and moral disintegration that left the country split between occupation and collaboration. Vichy France, the puppet state in the south, pretended at sovereignty while serving Berlin. Marseille became a bottleneck for refugees, Jews fleeing east, resistance fighters fleeing north, British soldiers cut off from Dunkirk. Nancy began small. She bought food for refugees. She let people sleep in her apartment. Henri, who understood what his wife was before she fully did, gave her money and asked no questions. Then a British officer arrived at her door, half-starved, desperate. She hid him, fed him, and used Henri's connections to secure false papers. Then another. Then a Belgian pilot. then a family with 3 children. Her apartment became a way station, and she became a courier, moving between safe houses, memorizing routes, learning the language of clandestine work. Dead drops, brush contacts, the art of vanishing in plain sight. She was not ideological. She did not quote de Gaulle or dream of republics. She simply could not bear the thought of doing nothing while the people she hid were hunted like animals. The network grew. She joined the WWII line, one of the most effective escape routes in occupied Europe, smuggling Allied soldiers and downed airmen over the Pyrenees into Spain. It was meticulous, exhausting work. A single mistake, a single informant could unravel months of operations. The Gestapo infiltrated networks with patient efficiency, turning couriers, torturing contacts until the entire chain was exposed. Nancy moved through this landscape with a mix of recklessness and discipline that baffled even her handlers. She would flirt with German officers at the Hôtel de Ville, extracting information while drinking them under the table, then spend the night guiding escapees through the sewers beneath the city. She dyed her hair, changed her clothes, adopted accents. The Gestapo knew someone was operating in Marseille, someone central to the WWII line, but their informants described different women: a blonde, a brunette, someone elegant, someone plain. They did not realize they were chasing a single person who remade herself like a stage actor between scenes. By 1943, they had compiled enough fragments to assemble a portrait. They called her the White Mouse because she gnawed through their traps and left no trace. The bounty climbed. 5 million francs. In a country where people were selling neighbors for a loaf of bread, that sum was a death sentence waiting to be purchased. Henri knew the danger, but he refused to flee. He believed, with the fatal optimism of decent men, that his status and his money would protect them. Nancy knew better. She had seen what happened to people the Gestapo wanted. Status meant nothing. Money meant nothing. In early 1943, the net tightened. Informants were closing in. A contact was arrested and, under torture, gave up a name, then another. Nancy's cover was unraveling thread by thread. Henri begged her to stop, to leave France, to disappear into the countryside. She refused. There were people depending on her. Operations mid-flight, soldiers hidden in attics waiting for her signal. Then one of her couriers was caught. Under interrogation, he broke. Not immediately, but eventually. Everyone broke eventually. The Gestapo came to the apartment while Nancy was away. They did not find her, but they found evidence. Photographs, letters, enough to confirm what they suspected. Henri was arrested. Nancy, returning to Marseille and sensing the trap, did not go home. She spent the night in a railway storage shed, shivering, watching the apartment from across the street as the lights burned and shadows moved behind the curtains. She never saw her husband again. She did not know, not yet, that he would refuse to give her up, that he would endure interrogation after interrogation, that he would die without speaking her name. She only knew that the life she had built was gone, and the only direction left was forward. She ran, not in panic, but with the cold, desperate calculation of someone who understood that survival was now a technical problem. She had 6 escape attempts planned, 6 different routes over the Pyrenees, each dependent on guides, weather, and luck. The first attempt failed when a snowstorm closed the passes. The second when her guide was arrested the night before departure. The third when a German patrol stumbled onto their group in the foothills and opened fire. She spent 4 days hiding in a barn, feverish, hallucinating, while the search parties swept the valley below. The fourth attempt brought her within sight of the Spanish border before a collaborator recognized her and she had to double back, hiking 70 kilometers through the mountains with no food and boots that disintegrated into rags. The fifth attempt ended when her group was betrayed by their guide, who led them directly into a Gestapo ambush. Nancy escaped by throwing herself into a freezing river and letting the current carry her downstream while bullets shredded the water around her. She crawled ashore miles away, hypothermic, bleeding, and walked back to the safe house on feet so damaged she could barely stand. It should have broken her. It should have been the moment she surrendered, turned herself in, accepted that escape was impossible. Instead, she rested for 3 days, stole new papers, and found a 6th guide. This time, she made it. The crossing took 6 days on foot through snow and ice, hunted by patrols, sleeping in caves, eating whatever they could forage. When she finally stumbled across the border into Spain, she was skeletal, frostbitten, unrecognizable. The Spanish authorities arrested her anyway. Franco's regime was nominally neutral but hostile to refugees. She spent weeks in a detention camp before British intelligence secured her release. By summer 1943, she was in London, debriefed by MI6, her story so extraordinary that some of the officers thought she was exaggerating. She was not. The SOE, the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, recruited her immediately. They needed agents who knew France, who had operational experience, who could blend into occupied territory and organize resistance. Nancy was all of that and more. But she was also a woman, and in 1943, the idea of sending a woman into combat operations was still controversial, still bureaucratic quicksand. She cut through the objections with the blunt force of her record. She had smuggled hundreds of people out of France. She had evaded the Gestapo for 3 years. She spoke French like a native, could handle weapons, and had already killed, though she did not elaborate on the circumstances. The SOE trained her anyway. Parachute jumps, demolitions, silent killing, ciphers, radio operation. She absorbed it all with grim focus. This was not adventure. This was preparation for return. Somewhere in France, Henri was still imprisoned, still alive as far as she knew. She intended to go back, to fight, and if possible, to find him. In April 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted into the Auvergne region of central France, one of 3 SOE agents tasked with organizing and arming the Maquis, the rural guerrilla fighters who had taken to the forests and mountains to avoid forced labor in Germany. Her code name was Heroine. Her mission was to coordinate sabotage operations in advance of D-Day, to disrupt German communications and supply lines, and to turn the scattered, poorly armed resistance groups into an effective fighting force. She was 31 years old. She was the only woman, and she was, within weeks, commanding over 7,000 men. The Maquis were not soldiers. They were farmers, clerks, deserters, communists, Republicans, anarchists, Jews, Spaniards who had fled Franco, teenagers who had never fired a gun. They were brave and desperate and disorganized, prone to infighting, short on ammunition, and constantly on the verge of starvation. The Germans hunted them with methodical brutality, burning villages suspected of harboring resistors, executing hostages, sending SS units into the hills to flush them out. Nancy arrived with radio codes, supply drop coordinates, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The men did not know what to make of her. A woman, parachuted from England, who drank pastis, swore like a soldier, and issued orders with the casual authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. Some resented her. Others were skeptical. None of them doubted her after the first firefight. It happened 3 weeks after her arrival. A German convoy, 20 trucks carrying munitions and troops, was moving through a valley the Maquis controlled. Nancy organized an ambush. 2 teams, one on each side of the road, with instructions to destroy the lead and rear vehicles, then pour fire into the center. It was a textbook operation, but textbook assumed discipline, timing, and experienced fighters. The Maquis had enthusiasm and rage. The ambush turned into chaos within seconds. One team opened fire too early. The Germans deployed, returned fire, and began to flank. Nancy, positioned on a ridge with a Sten gun, saw the attack collapsing and did the only thing that made sense. She stood, exposed herself to draw fire, and began shouting orders in French so loud and so profane that even the Germans seemed momentarily stunned. Her team rallied. They poured fire into the convoy, destroyed 4 trucks, killed 15 soldiers, and melted back into the forest before reinforcements arrived. Nancy was the last to leave, covering the retreat with short, controlled bursts, her face streaked with powder burns and dirt. When they regrouped at the camp, the men looked at her differently. Not as a British agent or a woman or a curiosity, but as a commander. She never had to prove herself again. The supplies came in waves. British planes, flying low under radar, dropped containers of weapons, explosives, ammunition, and medicine into fields marked by bonfires. Nancy coordinated the drops, encrypted the messages, and distributed the supplies with an efficiency that kept the Germans guessing. They knew the Maquis were being armed. They did not know how, or by whom, or where the next drop would occur. Nancy moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, always one step ahead of the patrols. She fought alongside the men, planned operations, arbitrated disputes, and drank them under the table when morale sagged. She was fearless in a way that unsettled even hardened fighters. During one ambush, she killed a German sentry with her bare hands when her gun jammed. A brutal, silent struggle in the dark that left her shaking and covered in blood. She did not speak about it afterward. There was no room for reflection, no time for horror. The war was a rhythm now, a drumbeat of violence and movement that allowed no pause. Then the radios stopped working. It happened in June, just as D-Day operations were accelerating. The Maquis were preparing a series of coordinated strikes on railway lines, bridges, and communication hubs, all timed to coincide with the Allied landings in Normandy. But without radio contact with London, they were operating blind. No confirmation of targets, no updates on German movements, no coordination with other networks. The radio operator tried everything, new frequencies, different schedules, equipment checks. Nothing. The problem, they finally determined, was the crystals, the small components that tuned the radio to the correct frequency. They were broken, and there were no spares. The nearest functioning radio was with another SOE team, over 200 kilometers away, across German-controlled territory, through checkpoints and patrols. Someone had to go. Nancy volunteered. The men protested. It was suicide. The roads were crawling with Wehrmacht units redeploying after D-Day. The Gestapo had intensified their sweeps. A woman traveling alone would be stopped, questioned, searched. Nancy pointed out, with impeccable logic, that a woman traveling alone was far less suspicious than a group of armed men. She would go by bicycle. She would carry false papers. She would be back in 3 days. She left at dawn with a bicycle, a handbag, and a pistol hidden in her clothes. The journey should have been impossible. The roads were patrolled. Checkpoints appeared without warning. The bicycle was old, the tires half flat, the roads rutted and broken by military traffic. She cycled through heat and rain, through villages occupied by German troops, past checkpoints where she smiled and flirted and presented her papers with the bored confidence of someone making a routine trip. She cycled until her legs cramped, until her hands bled from gripping the handlebars, until exhaustion became a kind of delirium. At one checkpoint, a German officer detained her, suspicious of a woman traveling alone. She told him she was visiting her sick mother. He asked why she didn't take the train. She said the trains were for soldiers now, not for French girls. He laughed, checked her papers, and waved her through. She cycled on. At night she slept in barns or ditches, hidden from patrols, listening to the distant rumble of artillery from the north where the Allies were pushing inland. On the third day, she reached the SOE team, delivered her message, received the crystals, and turned around. The return journey was worse. Her body was failing. The bicycle's frame cracked. She walked the last 30 kilometers, limping, delirious, clutching the crystals like a talisman. When she arrived back at the Maquis camp, she had been gone for 5 days and had cycled over 500 kilometers through occupied France. The men stared at her as if she were a ghost. She handed over the crystals, asked for a drink, and slept for 16 hours. The operations resumed. Railways were sabotaged, bridges blown, German convoys ambushed with increasing precision. The Maquis, once a nuisance, became a strategic threat, tying down German divisions that were desperately needed in Normandy. Nancy coordinated it all, moving between camps, liaising with other networks, calling in airstrikes on German positions. The SS responded with fury. They burned villages. They executed civilians. They sent an entire division into the Auvergne to crush the resistance. The Maquis, outnumbered and outgunned, fought a running battle through the mountains, ambushing patrols, sabotaging supply lines, and retreating before the Germans could pin them down. Nancy was in the thick of it, fighting, planning, surviving on adrenaline and cognac. The war had stripped her down to something elemental. Not heroism, not ideology, but the simple, brutal will to survive and to make the Germans pay for every meter of ground. By August, the Allies were advancing from the south and the north. The Germans were retreating. The Maquis emerged from the forests to liberate towns and villages, greeted as heroes. Nancy stood in the town squares exhausted, watching the celebrations, feeling nothing. The victory was real, but it was hollow. Somewhere in the chaos, she learned the truth. Henri was dead. He had been arrested in 1943, interrogated by the Gestapo in Marseille. They wanted Nancy. They wanted the names of her network, her contacts, her safe houses. Henri gave them nothing. They tortured him. Not once, but repeatedly, over weeks and months. They broke his bones. They starved him. They did things that the reports, filed after the liberation, described only in clinical euphemisms. He never spoke. He died in custody in October 1943, his body dumped in a mass grave, one more victim in a city full of them. Nancy learned this in stages, in fragments from survivors and resistance contacts, each new detail a fresh wound. She had not known. While she was training in England, he was dying. While she was parachuting into France, he was already buried. The guilt was irrational and absolute. She had run. He had stayed. She had survived. He had not. The Maquis fighters, hardened men who had seen every kind of suffering, watched her retreat into herself and did not know how to reach her. She drank more. She slept less. She volunteered for operations that bordered on suicidal, as if daring the war to finish what it had started. But the war was ending, and she was still alive, and that fact felt like a betrayal. The medals came later. Britain awarded her the George Medal, the United States the Medal of Freedom with Bronze Palm, France the Légion d'honneur, and the Croix de Guerre with 2 bronze stars and 1 silver gilt star. She accepted them with polite indifference. They were decorations for someone else, some fictional version of herself that existed in official reports and citations. The real Nancy Wake, the one who had cycled 500 kilometers and killed men with her hands and watched the man she loved die because of her, that woman did not feel decorated. She felt emptied. After the war, she tried to return to the life she had known, but that life no longer existed. Marseille was liberated but scarred. The apartment was gone. Henri's family blamed her, quietly, for his death. She drifted. She worked briefly for British intelligence, hunting war criminals, but the work felt like an epilogue to a story that had already ended. She moved to Australia, ran unsuccessfully for political office, married again, divorced, drank, traveled, gave interviews where she downplayed her wartime service as if it were an embarrassing, youthful indiscretion. She outlived the war by 66 years. She died in 2011 at the age of 98 in a London nursing home, her ashes scattered in the mountains of the Auvergne as she had requested. The Maquis fighters who had served under her, the few still alive, attended the ceremony. They remembered her not as the white mouse or the decorated agent, but as the woman who had fought beside them, who had led them, who had been more fearless than any of them and more broken than she ever admitted. What haunts is not the heroism, though the heroism is undeniable. It is the cost. Nancy Wake saved hundreds of lives. She armed and led thousands of resistance fighters. She was one of the most effective agents the SOE ever deployed. But the war took the man she loved, and it took the part of herself that could love without guilt. She spent the rest of her life running from the memory of what she had done and what had been done to her. In interviews, late in life, she would dismiss her wartime service with a shrug. "I killed a lot of Germans," she said once, "and I'm not sorry." But the flippancy was armor, a way of not talking about Henri, about the bicycle ride, about the sentry she strangled in the dark. She drank to forget. She joked to deflect. She minimized her own legend because the legend could not accommodate the grief. The Gestapo never caught the white mouse, but the war caught Nancy Wake, and it never let her go. The records are precise. The escape network she worked with saved an estimated 1,000 Allied servicemen. The Maquis units she commanded killed or captured over 500 German soldiers and destroyed dozens of supply lines, contributing materially to the success of the D-Day invasion. Her 500-kilometer bicycle journey is documented in SOE files and corroborated by multiple sources. The torture and death of Henry Fiocca are a matter of historical record, confirmed by post-liberation investigations. These are facts. They can be verified, cross-referenced, archived, but facts do not convey the texture of experience, the weight of memory. They do not explain what it felt like to cycle through enemy territory on bleeding feet, knowing that failure meant not just death but the collapse of operations depending on you. They do not explain the specific quality of guilt that comes from surviving when someone you love has died because they would not betray you. The historians can catalog her medals and missions, but they cannot touch the interior country of her grief, the private war that continued long after the public one ended. There is a photograph of her, taken in 1945, standing with a group of Maquis fighters in a liberated town. She is smiling, cigarette in hand, surrounded by men who are laughing, celebrating. If you look closely, though, the smile does not reach her eyes. She is performing joy, the way she once performed identities at Gestapo checkpoints. The real emotion is hidden, encrypted, readable only to those who know what to look for. This is the image that lingers, not the daring agent or the fearless commander, but the woman standing in the wreckage of victory, holding herself together by force of will, already beginning the long, lonely work of survival. The war had made her a legend, but legends are not Wren, and Nancy Wake was, above all, human. She bled, she grieved. She drank to numb the memories and told jokes to avoid talking about them. She accepted honors she did not want and spent decades trying to escape a past that followed her like a shadow. In her final years, she spoke more openly about Henri. Not in detail, never in detail, but in brief, unguarded moments that suggested the depth of what she had lost. "He was the love of my life," she said in one interview, her voice steady but her eyes distant. "I have never forgiven them for what they did to him." Them. The Gestapo. The war, history itself. She carried that unforgiveness to the end, a hard, bright core of rage that no amount of time could soften. It was, perhaps, the only thing that kept her alive as long as she did. Not hope, not peace, but the refusal to forgive, the refusal to forget. The Maquis remembered her as fearless. The SOE remembered her as effective. But she remembered herself as the woman who had loved a man and left him to die, and no amount of medals could absolve that. The truth, which she could never quite accept, is that Henri's death was not her fault. He chose to protect her. He chose silence over survival. The Gestapo killed him, not Nancy. But guilt is not logical, and grief does not require fairness. She carried both until the end. The mountains of the Auvergne are quiet now. The bunkers are overgrown. The villages remember the war in monuments and plaques, names carved into stone, most of them forgotten by anyone except the descendants who tend the graves. The forests where the Maquis hid are hiking trails now, walked by tourists who have no idea that 70 years ago, these trees concealed men and women fighting a war that most of the world had written off as lost. Nancy's ashes are somewhere in these mountains, scattered as she requested, returned to the soil she fought for. It is a poetic ending, the kind that documentaries favor. But poetry is a lie if it erases the cost. Nancy Wake did not die at peace. She died tired, old, far from the country she had saved, in a nursing home in a city that was not her home. She died with her medals in storage and her story half forgotten, remembered by historians and WWII enthusiasts, but largely absent from the popular memory of the war. She died knowing that the world had moved on, that the sacrifices of her generation were footnotes now, curiosities for documentaries. And she died, one hopes, with some measure of rest. Not peace, perhaps, but rest. The kind that comes when the war finally, definitively, ends. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse because she was impossible to catch, because she slipped through their nets and vanished into the shadows. But the nickname misses something essential. Mice are small, timid prey animals. Nancy Wake was none of those things. She was a force, a presence, a woman who commanded men in combat and cycled 500 kilometers through enemy territory and killed with her hands when she had to. If the Gestapo had understood what they were hunting, they would have called her something else. A wolf, perhaps, or a ghost, something that hunted back. But they never caught her, and they never understood her, and in the end that failure is its own kind of victory. She outlived them all. She outlived the Reich, the war, the century. She lived long enough to see the world forget, and then, slowly, begin to remember. The documentaries, the books, the retrospectives. The belated recognition that women like Nancy Wake were not auxiliary to the war but central to it, that resistance was not a footnote but a front, that courage wore many faces and spoke many languages. But memory is not justice, and recognition is not restitution. Nancy Wake spent the majority of her life carrying a grief that no amount of retrospective honors could touch. The war took her husband. It took her home. It took the version of herself that could live without the weight of what she had seen and done. What it gave her in return was survival, and a story that would outlast her, and a place in history that she never wanted. She would have traded it all, one suspects, for one more day with Henri. For the chance to go back to 1943 and make a different choice, to flee with him, to abandon the resistance and the networks and the soldiers hiding in attics, to choose love over duty. But history does not offer those choices retroactively, and the past is fixed, immutable, a scar that cannot be revised. She lived with that scar. She bore it with a stoicism that looked like strength but was closer to endurance. And when she finally died, at 98, the war died with her. Not the history of it, which will persist as long as there are archives and historians, but the living memory, the felt experience, the knowledge of what it was actually like to live through those years. That died. It dies with every veteran, every survivor, every witness. And what remains is documents, photographs, medals in museums, and stories. Stories like this one, trying and failing to convey the full weight of a life lived in the shadow of history. The final image is not heroic. It is small, domestic, unbearably human. Nancy Wake, near the end, sitting in a chair in her nursing home, looking out a window at a London street. The city moving on, indifferent, alive. Somewhere in her memory, the mountains, the bicycle, the checkpoints, Henri's face, the sentry's throat beneath her hands, the Maquis fighters calling her name, the parachute opening above the dark fields of France. All of it layered, compressed, carried. The war never ended, not really. It just became something you carried. And she carried it for 66 years, until her body gave out and her ashes were scattered in the country she saved. The wind took them. The mountains received them. And the white mouse, the woman the Gestapo could never catch, finally, quietly, vanished. Not into shadow this time. Into memory. Into the soil. Into the silence where all wars eventually go. The medals gathered dust in a drawer she never opened. Britain's George Medal, America's Medal of Freedom, France's Légion d'honneur. Medal and ribbon that weighed nothing and meant everything to everyone except the woman who earned them. In her final years, living alone in a London nursing home, Nancy Wake would sit by the window and watch the city move below her, indifferent and alive. Students hurried to lectures. Couples argued on street corners. Delivery trucks idled in traffic. The ordinary machinery of peace, the kind Henri never got to see. She was 98 years old, her body finally failing after carrying the war for 66 years. The Maquis fighters who survived still called her the bravest person they'd ever known. The historians catalogued her missions with clinical precision. 1,000 servicemen saved, 500 kilometers cycled through Nazi checkpoints, 7,000 resistance fighters commanded. But numbers could not touch the interior country of her grief, the private war that never ended. She had requested her ashes be scattered in the Auvergne mountains, the forests where she had fought and bled and survived. When she died in 2011, the few remaining Maquis veterans gathered in those mountains to honor her. They were old men now, carrying their own scars, their own silences. They scattered her ashes into the wind, and the wind carried them into the trees, into the soil, into the silence where all wars eventually go. The Gestapo never caught the white mouse, but the war caught Nancy Wake, and it never let her go. She spent her life running, from checkpoints, from patrols, from memory. In the end, she stopped running. The mountains received her, and the woman who could not be captured finally, quietly, came home.